poll for you guys to pick topics, and the two that came out were church history and theology of the body. They were pretty close. Since I have a little more time in the fall, I chose to just flip the order of them. So we'll do church history in the spring. But it seems like it was, I mean, I don't remember the exact numbers, but it seemed like they were really close as far as what people wanted. So that's at least the sort of reason for the topic, because you picked it, so then you guys also bear the blame if it goes sideways. Which is always good, because then I'm completely absolved from any.
That's not how that works.
I'm pretty sure.
You're still a free agent.
All right.
Pilot.
So a couple things. So why are we starting with, so theology of the body and Humani Vitae. Why are we starting with Humani Vitae? And after, how do you guys know what Humani Vitae is? Just in general.
We share a birthday.
Okay.
It was published on a birthday.
All right, I got that. All right, so we'll actually talk about what it was. But Humani Vitae was, we can talk about it now, was released July 25th, 1968, kind of in the midst of the sexual revolution, a little bit of the church's response to the sexual revolution. But for right now, before we sort of talk about it specifically, just to sort of understand not only the time in the world, but the time in the church, that day was the day that a lot of the Catholic Church became Protestant, where a lot of people said, that's too much. That's a hard saying, I can't live that. And you see sort of crazy ideas come out of this that have nothing to do with marriage and nothing to do with sex, and you hear much about like individual conscience, all those things all come out of this, all right? But it's a short document, and it pretty much was like a bomb dropped into the church. People weren't expecting it. A lot of priests have been telling people, oh yeah, the church is going to say the pill is fine. And they started changing their lives, and then all of a sudden Paul VI does this, which was totally not what they were expecting. In fact, the day after, now this is a day of, in the day of no internet, if you can possibly imagine that. And the day after it was released, 100 priests took out an ad in the New York Times, signing their name to it, saying, basically, this is a bunch of crap. Which means it's 100 priests who hadn't read it yet, obviously. It wasn't like they went on the Vatican website and read it. So they didn't know anything about it. So this is, if you ask sort of older Catholics, everyone knows what Humani Vitae is, but no one actually has read the document or knows what it teaches. But anyway, so Paul VI, after he releases it, on the next Wednesday, he basically says that, I brought clarity with this encyclical, but somebody needs to finish the work, because there's a lot still there to unpack. All right, and he said, still the magisterium of the church could and perhaps should return to this immense field with a fuller, more organic, and more synthetic treatment. Okay, and there was a cardinal in Poland who was up for it. In fact, he had already been helping the Pope a little bit, and we'll talk more about that connection in just a second. But then when John Paul II comes back, and some 25 years later, when he's actually giving theology of the body, he says, well, the whole purpose of this was just for us to reread Humani Vitae. Okay, so there's this intrinsic link between the two, where what John Paul II tries to do is give a theological explanation as to why Humani Vitae is true. All right, and so anytime you study theology of the body, you have to start with Humani Vitae just to understand it. All right, so that's why I'm starting with this. All right, and we're going to sort of try to follow the arguments a little bit, but see where the gaps are that John Paul II will then come and fill in. All right, yes.
Theology of the Body was not a papal encyclical, right? It was...
Right, yeah, so Theology of the Body was 129 some odd Wednesday audiences. Mm-hmm. And we'll talk more about that when we get to it. But yeah, it was not an encyclical. Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about the schedule real quick, and then we'll dive into it. So this should be on, I think it's on the Facebook page and on the website, but I just want to sort of just go through the logic of it so you sort of understand. This one is obviously the one where we talk about the connection to Humani Vitae. But what I also want to do before we get into theology of the body is talk about Love and Responsibility. Love and Responsibility is a book that a priest, John Paul II, Karol Wojtyła, wrote in the 1950s when he was working with married couples, and he was trying to help them understand what it was like to be attracted to someone of the opposite sex, and what it was like to get married, and what it was like, all those things. And he looks at it philosophically, and he really develops a philosophy of marriage based on a sort of Christian anthropology. And if you can unpack a little bit of love and responsibility, to me it's a little bit more accessible than Theology of the Body because it's not as big. But if you can sort of grasp what he's saying, it makes Theology of the Body much more understandable as well. All right, so he develops a certain language, a certain way to look at things, all those things. Okay, he looks at, well, what does it mean when what actually goes on interiorly in a woman when she sees an attractive man, or what goes on interiorly in a man when he sees an attractive woman. Okay, and then he says, so he's just looking at her as an object, right? An object of desire. But that object is also a subject. So what should the response be to a person? Okay? And that same book, Paul VI actually read before he wrote Humanae Vitae. So you see they're sort of intertwined. And so there's this, what's called, we'll talk about this too as well, there's a philosophy called personalism that does this, that says, okay, objectively we know what human nature is, but what is it like to be a person and experience these things? And so that's where we're going. So we'll do love and responsibility next week, and just again, make sure you guys realize that it's the only one that we're in the room from last year, 4101. And then we'll look at Theology of the Body. The first week will be introduction, where we talk about where we try to tie up what's in Humanae Vitae and love and responsibility and how it carries forward. And we'll talk about how John Paul II, his sort of philosophical worldview, and all those things. And then we'll go through the different sections of Theology of the Body. So it's original man, which is man before the fall, and then historical man, how we are now, including how we are being redeemed, and then eschatological man, which is just what we'll be like in heaven. And then we will talk about life in the kingdom now. So celibacy for the kingdom, marriage, love and fruitfulness all goes together. And then the last week, we'll talk about how we can actually take this and use it as an antidote for the culture of death. Okay? Any questions? All right, good. All right, so let's go back a little bit now and talk about just some of the historical context. Most of you know who, this may be the only Catholic talk you'll ever see where Margaret Sanger is quoted, but you guys know who Margaret Sanger is? Founder of Planned Parenthood? Anyway, so she was sort of I hate to call her a pioneer, but a pioneer in the sexual revolution. And she played on people's emotions a little bit. So she was really sort of advocating for free love. But what she did, and people still do this, is, well, look at all these poor Catholic women or poor women with all these kids. Look at, it's like the little old woman, who lives in a shoe. And she has this book called Motherhood and Bondage, which supposedly has thousands and thousands of letters that people wrote her, whether they actually were or not, different question. But these letters essentially are like women who are in seemingly impossible situations, can't keep their husbands off of them. What are they to do? And they're asking Margaret Sanger to help them. She was some redeemer. Okay? Yes.
Who was she that people would ask her for help?
So she was not to get too much into her history, but she was essentially in starting Planned Parenthood. She started with what's called the Birth Control League, and birth control in the 1920s was seriously taboo, and she was trying to break down the walls, and so she was pretty successful at doing it because she would play on people's emotions. She married into wealth, so she had wealth. She got to know a lot of sort of humanist and atheistic people that would support her work, and then ultimately, she starts Planned Parenthood. Okay. So, but here's the deal. The deal. To sort of catch what's going on, and these stories, even though she may have made them up, they're sort of legit too, because there's this idea. Okay, well, what is a woman supposed to do when she has 5, 6 kids under the age of 10, and they're sick, and she's sick, and she can't afford to feed them, and all these things. Okay, and so it's a legitimate question. Okay. And the relationship between men and women isn't good, even in marriage, for the majority of marriages. And so that's sort of where the world is, okay? And then there's also just the counter sort of move where the sexual revolution is just trying to completely take sex out of marriage and put it wherever it wants to go, all right? So that's the sort of context, okay? So there is legitimately people looking for ways to regulate birth. But there's also people who are asking for birth control who want neither of the two. They want neither births nor control. They just want to do whatever they want. All right, and so she ends up towards the end of her life in the 1930s. She meets a scientist who she funds to develop the pill. Okay, and so flash forward another 20 years, and we're in the 60s, and now the pill is out there, and that's what Paul VI is sort of coming to, all right, and that's where he's sort of coming from. One other sort of important point, though, is that throughout history of the church, Catholic, Protestant, doesn't matter, contraception was always thought to be wrong, okay, no matter what, until 1930. And then the Anglican Church, who get together every year in the Lambeth Conference, which is in England, decided it was okay if there were serious reasons for using it. Okay, and what they did is ended up opening up this Pandora's box, where, okay, well, what do you mean serious reasons? What are serious reasons? No guidance, no nothing. They just basically said, in those cases where there's such a clearly felt moral obligation to limit or prevent parenthood, and where there's a morally sound reason for avoiding complete abstinence, the conference agrees that other methods may be used, provided that this is done in the light of the same Christian principles. Notice the vagueness. The conference records a strong condemnation of the use of any methods of conception control for motives of selfishness, luxury, or mere convenience. All right, so this is where I almost said the rubber hits the road, and it really didn't mean to use that, but this is where it's out there now. Okay, so all these Christian groups follow suit, and except for one. Okay, and at the same year, actually on December 31st of the same year, Pope Pius XI issues an encyclical called Casti Connubii, in which he pretty much reiterates what the Church has always taught. Okay, and this is important for a couple of reasons. We'll read what I think is the most significant paragraph. It's obviously a long document. I don't want to go into it. Since therefore openly departing from the uninterrupted Christian tradition, some recently have judged it possible solemnly to declare another doctrine regarding this question. Okay, so he's talking directly to the people who have decided that it is okay for Christians to do this. The Catholic Church, to whom God has entrusted the defense of the integrity and purity of morals, standing erect in the midst of the moral ruin which surrounds her, in order that she may preserve the chastity of the nuptial union from being defiled by this foul stain, raises her voice in token of her divine ambassadorship, and through our mouth proclaims anew any use whatsoever of matrimony exercised in such a way that the act is deliberately frustrated in its natural power to generate life is an offense against the law of God and of nature, and those who indulge in such are branded with the guilt of grave sin. Right, so very unambiguously saying, hey, the Church has always taught this, it's not going to change. So that's the Church's initial response, okay, is this document. Yes?
What does that mean in Latin?
Casti Connubii, I don't remember. I forget what the first what the first words are. Yeah, if you look at the document, the first two words are whatever Catholic community is. So you got encyclicals. The titles of them are always the first two words, first two Latin words in the document. Chaste wedlock. Okay. So a couple of things, just while we're talking about encyclicals, or documents in general. When you read like church documents, it's really important you pay attention to footnotes. I know in general people don't pay attention to footnotes, but only because what the church does in footnotes is tell you where that teaching came from. So in other words, like throughout Casti Connubii, they'll say, okay, he'll reference something that Pope Leo XIII said. You go back to Pope Leo XIII, and he references something that Pope Pius IX said. And it just keeps going back, right? And there's a reason why the church does that, and it's to show when things belong to what's called the ordinary magisterium. Okay? So there's different ways that the church can teach infallibly. Okay, and we've talked about this before, but let's sort of just go over it very quickly so we sort of can put aside any questions of authority and just dive into the material. So there's obviously the Pope can make it what's called an ex cathedra statement, right? He can teach from the chair. He can say, I solemnly declare this to be true. And that's like, for example, the Immaculate Conception or the Assumption, all within the past 200 years, the Pope has said, infallibly, these things are true. But there's another way that the church can teach infallibly, and it's when they keep saying the same thing over and over and over and over. Okay? So from where you just begin to trace a line. All right, this is why the footnotes are important. Yes?
Is that like the situation with the death penalty change? Is that infallible teaching?
Yeah, we probably shouldn't even open that.
Okay, never mind.
Open that, yeah. I'll just leave that question dangling for a little bit. We could talk about it at some point, but I'll leave it dangling. But it is, what happens is if one pope says something, you take it pretty seriously. Mm-hmm. If two popes say it, you take it really seriously. 3 popes say it, 4 popes say it, 5 popes say it, you're going to say, oh no, this belongs in the infallible teaching of the church. Mm-hmm. Okay? And so that's why you go back to 1930 and you see him referencing, St. Augustine all the way through Pope Leo XIII, and then you say, okay, well, now when Paul VI writes Humanae Vitae, he refers to Casti Connubii more than anything else. And so you go, okay, so the church is saying everything, he's saying everything that Casti Connubii said, plus this. Okay? So it's important for us to understand this because what happens is, and this is really important in when we look at Humanae Vitae, the church is going to say things in different ways at different times. Because it's just, as time goes on, you got to express truths in different ways, right? Audiences, because of cultures, change. The way you say things change. And this is why I spent a little bit of time talking about the sort of the environment that Humanae Vitae is coming into, because for the longest time the church taught that the primary end of marriage is procreation and education of children. Okay? That's still true. It was still true when Paul VI said it, even though he never said it in the document, he put it in the footnote. Okay, so he refers right back to Casti Connubii, who says this. Okay, but people were not understanding what that meant. Okay, people were saying, okay, well, if I'm married, that means I could just abuse my wife to have as many kids as possible. Okay, so he's like, okay, it needs to be said differently. That's what Paul VI is saying. He says, I need to tell this truth differently. Okay, because when you say the primary end of marriage is procreation and education of children, there's all kinds of things packed into that, right? It's not just, popping out a baby and having a chalkboard in your house to teach your kids, right? You have to create an environment, a unity between parents in which the children are raised. All these things, so it's all packed in there, right? But it just needs to be unpacked and said in a different way, okay? And then this idea of what Paul VI was trying to do is infuse it with this sort of turn interiorly to the values of the person themselves, right? Because there's sort of, while it's objectively true that the primary end of marriage is procreation and education of children, there's not this sort of look at, if that's true, how do I subjectively live that out? Okay, so there's always, the truth is always, in a certain sense, not in a relativistic sense, subjective. So that I have to figure out how to take the objective truth and live it subjectively. And this is one of the sort of geniuses of John Paul II as a philosopher, is he learned how to do that. He learned how to explain things from that perspective. To look at it and say, yeah, so here's the objective truth of marriage. What does it look like? And what does it look like in the 21st century? Living that way. And then you try to lay it out. Okay? And so that's what makes Humanae Vitae different. Okay? It didn't change any teaching. It just changed the angle from which it was taught. And of course, hopefully, like all things, goes deeper. Okay? And sort of has a more, helps us to reflect a little more deeply on the reality of marriage. And not just marriage. It says in the first paragraph, he says, we really need to reflect on what the human person is. Okay? Not as a rational animal, because that's what he objectively is, but what subjectively within each person. How can we look subjectively within each person? How can we look at their desires, that where their heart is, everything? How do we look at that so that the person truly ends up happy? Okay? And that's a totally different question and a totally different way to approach things, even though you end up in the same place. Okay? And that's, like, as you sort of go through the semester, keep that in mind. Like, that's what John Paul II is going to constantly keep doing. He's going to go, what's your experience? What is your experience like? And then he's going to help, hopefully, to explain the experience and go, yeah, that experience points to this objective truth. And in a certain sense, that experience is natural. Okay? And that's why Love and Responsibility is such an important book, because he says, okay, let's look at the experience of a man being attracted to a woman, or a woman being attracted to a man, and let's try to look at what that reveals about women and men, and then help them move towards seeing the other person as truly as a person, and then each person being affirmed and all that. Okay? All right, so that's where it sort of is. Does that make sense? So that's the sort of framework. So Humanae Vitae, what makes it a little bit different than Theology of the Body is Paul VI comes at everything from a natural law understanding. Okay? Whereas John Paul II, he's going to assume all that's already true, and he's going to look at it from a theological perspective. All right? And he's going to start from the very beginning. He's going to look at the Trinity and say, how does man made in the image of God? What the heck does that mean? And what does that mean for each one of us? So, the defense of Humanae Vitae, if you want to call it a defense, he's going to fall back on natural law reasoning. Right? Here's what he said. This kind of question requires from the church authority, the authority of the church, a new and deeper reflection, see, this is what we're talking about, on the principles of the moral teaching on marriage. A teaching which is based on the natural law, as illuminated and enriched by divine revelation. No member of the faithful could possibly deny that the church is competent in her magisterium to interpret the natural moral law. It's just saying the church is the authentic interpreter of the natural law. In carrying out this mandate, the church has always issued appropriate documents on the nature of marriage, the correct use of conjugal rights, and the duties of spouses. Okay, so let's talk about why it's necessary for him to have this new and deeper reflection on the principles of marriage. So, what's different about now? Different about 1968 is the pill. Okay, so the pill doesn't change the nature of the act between the man and woman in its physical dimension, right? So they're not doing anything to change the act itself during the act. Okay, so when the woman is on the pill, it changes her biology so that the act itself is done within an infertile time period. Okay, so it's a little bit different, right? It's a little bit different, and some people are saying, well, you're just doing something the body naturally does anyway. The woman naturally has infertile periods. You're just extending that. Why would that be wrong? Right? And this is what Paul VI is trying to sort of tackle, right? So I think it's important just to sort of understand a little bit about the pill itself, how it works. Not with any sort of depth, but so it changes a woman's biology by acting hormonally. It tricks her body into thinking she's pregnant. Okay, and so when a woman is pregnant, there's changes in her reproductive system. Okay, including she doesn't produce more eggs, right? So it inhibits ovulation. That's one of the ways it works. It thickens the cervical mucus, which would sort of inhibit the sperm meeting the egg. And then it also thins and shrivels the lining of the uterus so that a newly conceived fetus could not attach to the uterine wall. Okay. That last thing, though, what is that? When it says it changes in the endometrium, which reduce the likelihood of implantation. When does life begin?
Conception.
So what does that make this really?
An abortifacient.
Abortifacient, right? So the thing is that many people don't realize is that that's how the pill works, and you don't know which of the three ways it's working. It just works that way. It does all three of them, and you have no idea. So women who are on the pill, they can be pregnant and have an abortion and not know it. Okay, and I've seen numbers of, if they were to add those to the abortion numbers, they would probably triple. Okay, because if life begins at conception and you're interrupting the life path of that child, that's called an abortion. Okay. Yes.
So just to say, it's not that only that makes the pill wrong.
No. But the point is, and Paul VI talks about this, and John Paul II talks it too, that they're really fruit of the same tree, right? Abortion, morally speaking, is much worse than contraception, but they're both wrong. Okay. Yes.
Also, the way you said it kind of sounded like it's the same culpability, but is it the same culpability for the abortifacient?
So in other words, no, on a subjective level, is it? I mean, if you know this and you're willing to risk it, it's like the example. If you I don't know, you want to kill your roommate and you decide to cut the brake line in his car, right? And he backs out of the driveway and his car flips over in a ditch without him hitting the brakes. Well, are you still guilty of cutting the brake line? Yeah. Did it actually happen that way? No. Right. So your subjective intention was still the same, even if the objective thing didn't happen. So that level of culpability. But I mean, the fact of the matter is, I would say that you ask 95% of people this question and they wouldn't know that. That was really. It was good. You guys all caught that very quickly. So I mean, even that in and of itself, you can't be. There's sort of this separation between Catholics and Protestants, especially like the pro-life movement. You can't be pro-life and also contracept. You can't be pro-life and contracept because of the pill, but contraception means against life, right? So there'll always be this sort of foundational difference between Catholics and Protestants in the pro-life movement. And you're seeing a lot of Protestant pastors who will read Humani Vitae, who are really involved in pro-life, and they're like, I have to live that way. And then they'll convert to the Catholic Church. They're like, man, they were right about this. They're probably right about everything. So that's why understanding the truth of this is really important. Yes, Sean.
Just as a note, I saw a Facebook post maybe yesterday that was spreading misinformation on what the effects of the pill are. So it's definitely a compassion issue. A lot of people don't know what it actually means to do the pill or to take the pill. So it's
I mean, you don't want to jump on someone and go, you're abortionist, murderer, taking.
Yeah, never.
Because usually, I mean, most people are acting out of ignorance, right? And they're just literally swallowing what the culture is telling them. But there are people too that is a little, I remember I think it might have been after we had our second child, I had a conversation with my wife's OB, who was a Protestant Christian guy. He wanted to put her on the pill. She was like, no. And And I was in there with her, and I started talking. I was like, that's an abortifacient. He's like, no, it's not. And he pulled out his little position paper that he wrote. I was like, I don't need to read your position paper. Let's just pull out the physician's desk reference. That's where I got that thing from. And I was like, what is that? He's like, well, there's a question about when life begins. I'm like, well, no one ever questioned it before. So, I mean, there's people who know who, you know, the way we are, we'll find ways like verbal gymnastics to rationalize, right? So what people will do to get around that is say, well, life doesn't begin at conception. And by the way, that is exactly why when, like, in places like Colorado, when it gets on the ballot, that life begins at conception, why it will never get passed. Because then what happens? Birth control pills become illegal. Right? If you declare that, or they at least become abortifacients, right? They actually get labeled as that. That's why, you know, the pro-life movement does that. Like the people who really know what they're doing, like, okay, if we can get this on there, it's not just a question about abortion, it's a question about birth control pills, which, oh, by the way, you know, 90% of the people in the state are on it, and, you know, so it's important we know these things, right? Okay, so let's sort of back up then, and then go back to what he said about the natural law. How many of you guys remember us talking about the natural law? Okay.
When was that?
I don't know. I mean, I know some of the people in the movement were there, but it was probably a while ago. Anyway, so you can look at human nature, right? This is the basis of the natural law. You can look at human nature and know what's good for you, right? Like, I don't know. You need oxygen, so air is good for you, right? And then flipping that over, depriving someone of air is bad, right? Morally wrong. Okay. So the natural law is just based on this idea that there's this fixed human nature, and that we can know what is good for us. And it's not just that we need air or food, or we need other things too. Okay. And so St. Thomas, when he talks about this, and this, by the way, Paul VI talks about it. It's in his footnote. He talks about St. Thomas's teaching on the natural law. So St. Thomas says all these things, all these inclinations that we have, are towards four basic goods. Okay, and we can play a game where we can sort of connect everything to these four basic goods. But he says, okay, every human person has a desire or an inclination to protect their own being. Okay, so they preserve their life. So everything that has to do with life is a good. Every human person has this inclination towards marriage and procreation and the bringing up of children, okay? Which, the first one is all animals, right? The second is distinctly human. Right? Because only humans actually procreate, which is really important for us to understand, right? We don't reproduce. You guys sort of catch this, why we make that distinction? Why do we call human reproduction procreation?
Because it's more intentional.
Well, there's part of that's absolutely part of it. Yes.
It's not simply an animal process, but it's also spiritual and involves the genesis of the soul with God.
Yeah, that's the important point, right? So we call it procreation because we can't do it without God. Not in the sense that we can't do anything without God, but in the sense that God creates a soul at the moment of conception as that person is created. Okay? And that doesn't that's the place where God still consistently creates in creating new human beings. Okay? So in man it's a participation in God, in God's creation of another human person, right? The third sort of inclination we have is man is social by nature. And John Paul II will use this as the basis of his theology of the body when he talks about man made in the image of God, not just because he can reason and love, but also because he's social by nature, with the Trinity. And then the fourth is the knowledge of the truth. So we have this just innate desire to know the truth about things. Okay? And not just to know the truth, but to communicate the truth. And so everything that we say is wrong harms one of these four things. Okay, so it's not a matter of just these arbitrary laws. Yes.
Wrong in the natural law or wrong in like the moral law? Or,
Well, the moral law is based upon the natural law. So when we say wrong, we mean sort of as a moral judgment. Anything that's wrong would harm one of these four. So think of something.
Yeah, I guess the best kind of example I can come up with is the obligation to go to Mass on holy days, since that's not part of natural law. That was
Yeah. So what John Claude said is important. So there's also revealed law, right? Like you could reason to honoring God, but the manner in which you're supposed to honor God, you can't necessarily reason to, right? That's why typically when you see this produced, think of the Ten Commandments, how it comes on 2 tablets, the first 3 are on 1 tablet. Those are things that may or may not, in most cases, probably have to be revealed to us. The second tablet are things that we can sort of discover on our own, even if it took a long time. So lying. Why is lying wrong? Yes.
it's against the knowledge for the truth, but you could also say like living in society, it's a perversion of like her faculty of speech.
Yeah, it hurts trust, and it's an offense against the truth. Why is stealing wrong? Yes.
You're harming your brother, so.
Yep. You're harming society. No society can be built upon.
Liars and thieves.
Yes. Liars and thieves. How about contraception? Why is contraception wrong?
Probably all 4.
Yeah, in some respect, but very specifically, it does harm to the good of marriage, right? Marriage. So all of these things are intrinsically good. They're not good for something else, right? I don't say, I want to know the truth so that blah blah. The truth in and of itself is an intrinsic good. Okay. I don't form a society with other people so that I can do X, Y, Z. Okay. I don't get married so that I can do X, Y, Z. So they're intrinsically good.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Rather than the opposite of that would be instrumentally good. I take something and use it for something else. So contraception is wrong from a natural law standpoint because it harms the good of marriage. Okay, if you know these 4 things, I've had tons of conversations with atheists, specifically about contraception, and had them agreeing with me once I taught them this. Once I taught them how to really look at that. That once you can see that marriage is a good, then anything that harms marriage would be bad. And then show how contraception, which is what Paul VI then does, shows how contraception hurts marriage. Yes, Keaton?
So if something does not necessarily fulfill all of these, is it inherently bad?
No, so look at it in the sense of if it harms one of them. So it doesn't, it would be hard, you could sort of vaguely, these are like first principles, and you might have to go a couple principles to connect to one, but you can say, okay, if this hurts this thing, it's bad, right? Yes.
Can you talk about the order of these and why that's important?
Yeah. So the maybe you should, since you brought it up.
table.
Okay. So basically, these goods are in order of their primacy. Which good is more important? I.e., the good of life is before the good of marriage, because the good of marriage requires the good of life, and then the good of society requires the good of marriage and the good of life, and then knowledge of the truth is kind of separate. I'm not really sure how that.
So the way to close that though is they actually go the other way too. What you said is exactly right, but they go the other way too. So the knowledge of the truth is a higher good because more people share in it. Living in society is a higher good. Marriage is a higher good. So see how it's completely, totally personal in the first one. Absolutely necessary. But so that you can sacrifice a lower one for a higher one. So martyrdom. I'm giving up my life for the truth. Okay? Because truth is the highest good that we can achieve in this life. Still requires the other 3. But you can forego the other 3 in order to. So that's where there is a primacy in one direction and the other. So up and down.
So could you say that like priesthood would be a sacrifice of the second one for the fourth?
Yep, absolutely. Okay. So this is just the general idea. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how he employs it. I think I may have already talked about this, about just as procreation having the end, or marriage having the end of procreation. Yes.
I'm seeing like pronouns capitalized in the text, like.
Yeah. So there was a habit. I don't know which pope stopped doing it, but it's what's called the magisterial we, like a king doing it. Like he'll say we and he'll capitalize it. That's probably what you're seeing. That's not, we have spoken fully elsewhere in the Christian. So what he's doing, by doing that, he's saying, it's not just, Paul VI saying this, popes have said this, right? So Peter is saying this, we. That's why he does that. Okay, so we already talked about, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. But we already talked about how the church for a long time talked about the end of marriage, its purpose being the procreation and education of children. And that just comes from, if you want to know what a thing is, look at what it does. Okay, that's all the church was saying. But it doesn't, what Paul VI wants to do is move towards what it means, what marriage means, so it's meaning. Okay, and that's where he wants to unpack where what it really means, procreation and education of children, unpack that to, okay, what is all tied in that? Right? Because, going back to Margaret Sanger's letter, was that really a good marriage just because they were having a ton of kids? Okay. And that's what the church sort of wanted to get away from because people were getting confused by that. All right. All right. So now we're going to, and the church does this now, talks about the two meanings of marriage. The sexual activity in which husband and wife are intimately and chastely united with one another through which human life is transmitted is, as the recent council recalled, noble and worthy. It does not, however, moreover, cease to be legitimate, even when, for reasons independent of their will, it is foreseen to be infertile. For its natural adaptation to the expression and strengthening of the union of husband and wife is not thereby suppressed. The fact is, as experience shows, that new life is not the result of each and every act of sexual intercourse. God has wisely ordered laws of nature and the incidence of fertility in such a way that successive births are already naturally spaced through the inherent operation of these laws. The Church, nevertheless, in urging men to the observance of the precepts of the natural law, teaches that each and every marital act must of necessity retain its intrinsic relationship to the procreation of human life. Okay, so people will talk about this term as being open to life. Okay, so doing nothing, maybe we should talk here, it might help, just to talk about, just sort of to be able to think about the act of fertilization, okay? Do a man and woman have any control over that? Is there any action that they can do to ensure fertilization?
Not to ensure.
Okay. So that's something that happens outside of our control, right? Everybody sort of agree with that?
What about like in vitro?
Right. Let's talk about just in the natural order, and then we can go to that. We'll see why that's wrong too. So in the natural order, is there anything, despite all the, kind of witch doctor taboo, like these little things that people try to come up with, there's nothing that you can do to ensure fertilization. It is independent of the marital embrace itself. Okay, so a couple comes together, and then that thing happens after. Okay, with no control over it, they have no control over it. Okay, that's sort of important for us to grasp. Okay, because this idea of being open to life means that you do nothing, you personally do nothing to inhibit that thing from possibly happening. Okay. Now, are there times when that won't happen? Yeah, right? I mean, the woman is fertile, certain amount of time in the month, and there can be other reasons why that doesn't happen. But in general, once the act is performed, it's out of the control. Okay. All right. We'll talk about more why this is important in a second when we sort of talk about why NFP is different from contraception. Okay, so this particular doctrine, often expounded by the magisterium of the church, is based on the inseparable connection, this is the point, established by God, which man on his own initiative may not break, between the unitive significance and the procreative significance, which are both inherent to the marriage act. The reason is that the fundamental nature of the marriage act, while uniting husband and wife in the closest intimacy, also renders them capable of generating, notice how it says capable of generating new life. And this as a result of laws written into the actual nature of man and of woman. And if each of these essential qualities, a unitive and a procreative, is preserved, the use of marriage fully retains its sense of true mutual love and its ordination to the supreme responsibility of parenthood to which man is called. Okay? So that's more or less what I just said, but he's introduced the language that's important. Unitive and procreative. So when you look at the marital act, its meaning is to be procreative and unitive. Right? What if you say, what's it for? Right? It's for those two things. Okay. So you see how I sort of changed the language a little bit. Okay, fine. It's for those two things. Well, in order then to be a true act, then those two things have to be preserved. Right? Why? Why do those two things? Why can't they be separated? Because this is sort of the crux of the argument, right? Like, well, we can't have children right now. But we really, the unitive part is really important. It makes us, it's an act of love. It makes us feel closer, whatever. Why can't you just then say, okay, well, I'm going to contracept so that we can be closer?
It denies the subject and looks back, how you were saying earlier, like it looks at the other person as simply an object for pleasure, but denies part of their nature as human that can procreate.
So that's really important what you just said. Go ahead, John Paul.
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially, by denying one, you sort of deny the other. You're not going to be completely unitive with denying the procreative aspect of it.
Okay. Let's unpack what you just said, okay, in a sort of more succinct way. So, man and woman, in an organic way, we are each capable of doing everything we need to do to survive, right? Except one thing. We need somebody else for it. Okay? What is that one thing? Procreation, right? All right. So, I'll just read this and then we can sort of unpack it. Though a male and female are complete individuals with respect to other functions, for example, nutrition, sensation, locomotion, with respect to reproduction, they are only potential parts of a mated pair, which is the complete organism capable of reproducing sexually. Even if the mated pair is sterile, intercourse, provided it is reproductive behavior characteristic of the species, makes the copulating male and female one organism. All right, so what is he saying? Right. So what is it on a biological level, and we'll talk about why this isn't just about biology, that unites the spouses? That the act is ordered to procreation, right? Because it's the only thing that they can do together, right? And we already said, well, the actual part of procreation, that's out of their control. But if the act itself is ordered to that, they are actually united on a biological level. All right? And so to be unitive, it must also be procreative in nature. Okay, the in nature part is obviously important because we said it's already out of our control. Right? So, if you introduce contraception, you've actually destroyed the unitive meaning as well, because you're no longer united on that level. Okay, and remember, the important part of this is not just biology, but it's not just animalistic; it's a person. Right? And the marital act is a total gift of one person to another. And so by introducing contraception into it, suddenly they're not united any longer. Okay? So just even on this level, we say, I begin to see why they can't be separated. And then John Paul II will go even deeper in theology of the body. But even just on this mere biological level, they're not one, call it an organism, when the act is not ordered to itself. Does this make sense? But yes, maybe. Yes.
Wouldn't they technically not be one biologically if there wasn't a conception?
Not
all.
But this is why it's important as a person, right? Like in the fact that they have a will, they're willing to do that. Whether it actually happens is out of their control, right? So that's why it's important to look at it not just in biology, but in the person, right? So you look at the subjective intention, right? And this is why, like, even an infertile couple, it's the same thing. It doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter because the act is still ordered towards procreation. The reason why it's an infertile act is outside of their control.
Yeah, it's like it's not so much whether it works or not. It's like what you're aiming at, I guess. Because I don't know. It's like really specific wording, but
It's probably not in that way.
no, I don't know. But I don't know. I like to use a bad example. I guess would be the difference between eating and chewing food to spit it out. Like, it looks like it, but if it's not, I don't know, it's not about whether or not it's possible. But it's like, if you're deliberately saying, I don't want this to happen, then you're no longer actually doing what it is. Because that's what it is.
Yeah, and what you need to begin to see is that really is not just a rejection of the end result. It becomes a rejection of the person, so that you're no longer united to that person. So you're saying, I love everything about you, but your fertility. So just put that aside, and we're good. All right. And as we'll see when we talk about theology of the body, total gift. This idea of total gift of self, made in the image of the Trinity, right? Father and the Son, completely pouring themselves out to each other, so that fruit comes with the Holy Spirit. Yes.
So, like with John Claude's example, so marriage is procreative and unitive, or the marital act is, and then the nature of food is like it's pleasurable to eat, and it's also you get sustenance from it. But then, like, the reason that drinking a Diet Coke that denies the sustenance but still has the pleasurable isn't wrong, or I don't know, maybe it is wrong, whereas denying the procreative aspect of the marital act is because of the object. Like,
well, yeah. So it is the object. So has God built into His design times when couples can still come together in a marital embrace and not have children?
yes.
Okay. So this is an important argument, sort of, right? And so when we decide that we're going to usurp that, so to say, your design kind of sucks. Like, I don't really like it. It's not convenient for me. Like, I'm in a town. It's just not convenient. What are you ultimately saying? I'm God, you're not. Right? Like, God, thanks for your help.
I guess the way to complete it with that analogy is, bear with me. Have you seen Willy Wonka?
Yeah.
It's
always about a movie.
Always about a movie.
Because there's the thing you can chew, and it's like there's the gum, and it's like a meal in the gum. So it's like you get the pleasure of the meal, but none of the calories or the whatever.
So Coke Zero is wrong.
Yeah, I think you would have trouble with saying that a diet soda is wrong, only because you're still drinking stuff that you need.
Yeah,
you could probably throw in the gum is a better example, probably.
Yeah.
Or like, yeah, maybe that.
Wouldn't it just be gluttonous?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to pick up the speed just a little bit. So in the encyclical, he gives a definition of contraception, and I just sort of want to throw it out there. So the next few are just sort of nuggets, sort of from that we'll sort of come back to. The part in italics is what I want to sort of go over. Similarly excluded. Here's a definition of contraception: any action which either before, at the moment of, or after sexual intercourse is specifically intended to prevent procreation, whether as an end or as a means. Okay. What happens if a woman is on, I don't even know if such a thing exists, medication that renders her infertile and she doesn't know it?
She's not at fault if that's true.
Yes. What if it renders her infertile and she does know it renders her infertile?
Depends on what she's taking.
Depends on why she's taking it, right? So all these things, that's important, right? Again, putting the abortifacient thing aside. All right, so it matters. The intention matters. Not the only thing that matters, but it matters. Okay. So it's anything that you directly say, I'm doing this so that this doesn't happen. Okay. And the reason why that part is important is because NFP can become that sometimes. Although John Paul II says, we'll talk about it in a minute, that maybe it could in theory, but it never actually does in practice.
It doesn't work very well. But like that's one of the things he says. I think like if you're using it for a bad reason, it's not going to work.
Well, he actually says like if you're using it for a bad reason, like God pulls an end around on you and you find out that you do have more self-control now. You do have more. All these things actually still happen. You still grow in virtue and you didn't even want to.
Drat.
That's my word. I mean, he says it much more elegantly. I think I may have to add to the quote. But yeah, that's what he's saying. Okay, so let's go to Paul VI, when he opens the encyclical, he says, okay, I want to look at some of the objections. Why this pill is harder to swallow than the other one. And so he says, okay, well, I keep finding basically two reasons why people think that this is good. And he's saying mostly just within marriage. So he's not even really dealing with it in the sort of hedonistic sense. So it's okay, the demand of married life, demands are so much different now, and they're way different than they were then, that it becomes almost a necessity to contracept. And then he says, well, what about like overpopulation and all these things people are talking about, or just the fact that, these women like Margaret Sanger was dealing with, where she said, there's this woman who has 6 kids under the age of 10, and can't do anything. They're sick. She can barely take care of herself. Can't take care of them. Is there a level of responsibility in this? Okay. And so to answer that, what Paul VI says is, men rightly observe that a conjugal act imposed on one's partner without regard to his or her condition or personal and reasonable wishes in the matter is no true act of love, and therefore offends the moral order in its particular application to the intimate relationship of husband and wife. So what he's saying is, yeah, you can use your wife when you're using contraception, but you can also use her as a baby making factory too. All right, and that's just as legitimately wrong as using her just for pleasure. Okay. I don't know that you'd ever find women are not incubators in an encyclical, but that would be Pope Rob's version. If they further reflect, they must also recognize that an act of mutual love which impairs the capacity to transmit life, which God the Creator, through specific laws, has built into it, frustrates His design, which constitutes the norm of marriage and contradicts the will of the author of life. So this sort of just goes back to what I said, where it's sort of this very real way in which we try to usurp God. He has a plan for this. He has a plan for when couples can come together just to unite, and He has a plan for when they can come together and unite and actually procreate. And to discern His will is to stick to His plan. Hence, to use this divine gift while depriving it, even if only partially, of its meaning and purpose, is equally repugnant to the nature of man and woman, and is consequently in opposition to the plan of God and His holy will. But to experience the gift of married love while respecting the laws of conception is to acknowledge that one is not the master of the sources of life, but rather the minister of the design established by the Creator. All right, so it's sort of, I think I already said that, but so those letters have a point, right? That there became a certain point where men began to look at their wives simply as just available all the time, and if they get pregnant, that's their problem. Okay. Further on, he says, a self-discipline of this kind is a shining witness to the chastity of husband and wife, and far from being a hindrance to their love of one another, transforms it by giving it a more truly human character. And if this self-discipline does demand that they persevere in their purpose and efforts, it has at the same time the salutary effect of enabling husband and wife to develop to their personalities and to be enriched with spiritual blessings. All right, so one of the arguments against this is that it destroys spontaneity. Okay? That, couples, we're sitting around eating popcorn and watching TV and get a little itch and, well, let's go to the bedroom. Like, that's totally ruined now. I can't do that, right? And this is a legitimate argument, by the way. Like, people actually argue this way. They're like, man, you have to plan, like, natural family planning. You have to plan everything out. Like, why is that? What's wrong with that argument?
We're not supposed to be slaves to our passions.
What does spontaneity actually mean? Well, it just means I got an itch, I got to scratch it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's spontaneity. When I itch, I got to scratch it. Is that a human action, or is that right? So it's a full human gift. Like, so what does it require? It requires my intellect and my will. An act of love requires that I know and love what I'm doing. Okay, so it takes reflection. And without reflection, it's not really a human act. It's animal, right? It's animal in its way, nature. Okay? So, when you have to do that, what happens to the person? This is sort of why I said, jump on the second set about NFP pulling an end around on you. When you're forced to reflect, even though you really don't like it, but you're kind of forced to, you grow in virtue, right? And then it becomes easier. And then as virtue grows, when we talk about virtues, what happens when you get good at a virtue? You actually like it, right? There's this fruit to it. Where you go, oh, this is actually more loving than doing that. And I actually know this. I actually know that this is more loving. And I like that I love like this. I like that, obviously I'm going to say from a man's perspective, that I like that her fertility is also mine. Because men are fertile all the time, right? Women, not so much. And so the man then takes on his wife's fertility. He bears the burden of it or the joys of it. Right? And they truly become one flesh. And that's sort of the definition of love, right? And so this sort of idea that it really inhibits spontaneity really is just, what they really mean is it just inhibits me sort of indulging whenever I want. Okay. All right. So we already talked about it a little bit. So how, in general, is NFP different from contraception, other than the sort of the mechanical aspects? Let's talk about it from a moral standpoint. How are they the same? Same results, right?
Mm-hmm.
Theoretically. Okay, so if you have a certain way of looking at things, it's called consequentialism, where you just look at the end and go, well, the end's the same. What does it matter how I get there?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I got $1 million. I could rob a bank, or I could work for it. So we don't just look at ends, we look at means too, right? So the means actually matter. How you get there matters. And so why, there are perfectly good reasons. I don't know why that did this. That he talks about. There are perfectly good reasons to avoid being pregnant. Right? And this is one of the things that the church didn't really teach, like in the 30s. Pope Pius XI and XII started talking about this. Were called just reasons, which he talks about. Like there are times when a couple should go, yeah, we shouldn't have any more children right now. We shouldn't have children right now, period. Okay? There are just reasons to do that. Right? Reasons to serve. They don't want to, and I don't know why. There are, these reasons can be they're not certainly not trivial, but they don't have to be life-threatening either. Okay, this is one of those things where people struggle with. Okay, what are just reasons? Well, that's something you sort of got to decide on your own. If it's another kid means that I can't get a boat, probably not a good reason.
Dang it.
But another kid means that my wife is going to go absolutely nuts, probably a good reason. Don't have another kid right now because one of our children is sick all the time. Probably a good reason. Right? Probably a just reason. Don't have another kid because the government officials will come and take that child. Probably another good reason. Okay? So there are reasons. There are good and just reasons not to have more children. Yes?
What about if you're in China
Oh,
and there's the one-child policy and the government will take that child or force you to pay a huge fine or something?
Yeah, I mean, that is a good reason not to have another child. But
Okay.
the means by which you don't do that matter.
Uh-huh.
Right? That's the important point. Like, if they have a one-child policy, it's unjust,
Mm-hmm.
but are you going to bring unnecessary suffering upon your family and upon that child by doing that? Probably not a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So there are good reasons. The point is that they can't be selfish reasons. Okay, but they can be self-serving in the sense that that right now is just not a good time for one or both of us, or for the situation, or for our other children, or for even genetically, like we're likely to have a child that has this problem. That might be a good reason to avoid it. You would weigh the medical, all that, but there are just reasons to postpone, even indefinitely.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's important too, and I think the point is that, and this is where NFP again becomes a blessing. There's an inherent generosity attached to it, in which you're generously thinking about having more children, and it creates. And John Paul II talks about this. It creates a different home life too, where you don't use your children just because they make you happy or bring you joy. Right? You begin to see if you cannot use the person closest to you, then you won't use anyone. Right? Because it's but if you will use the person that you've pledged to give your life to, you will use anyone for anything. Yes.
So how do we take this knowledge and face the reality of, like, I've talked to multiple married couples or heard stories about different married couples that have had issues where, maybe the mother was told by a doctor she would likely die if she had another child, or serious consequences like that, and then even a priest says contracept. How do we deal with a church that...
Yeah, people don't like to hear this, but like abstinence is not the worst thing that can happen to you. Like, I know that it sounds like, oh, that's so cold, but there's this tendency to think that well, we have to do this thing, so how can we make this thing work? We spend 99% of our lives abstaining. Anyway, like you're all doing it right now. I'm doing it with you. So it's not you're not going to die from it, right? Like that's so Freudian to think that way. But by the same token, you don't want to tell someone, hey, you know what? You just can't do that, right? I mean, this day and age, like NFP, I can tell you just sort of, there is, I mean, you can, it's a science. It's like, it is, it is by far the most effective birth control. It's not even close. Like, the pill at its best is like 90%. NFP, when practiced correctly, is in the 96-97%. So, just from common sense, if you're gonna go down that route, you probably want the best thing to use. And again, that's not an accident, right? Like, God is God is God, right? Like, we can come up with a pill to try to make it better, and we can think it's great. But I got to be honest with you, if my wife's life was on the line, I like my chances with 97%. rather than 90%. Just saying. So that's part of it, right? Okay, hold on a second. Just do the math. Is this realistic? But, I mean, in a lot of ways, you just got to kind of tell the guy to man up. Be like, why would you put your wife's... Like, is it that big of a deal? Like, is it the end of the world if this doesn't happen for X amount of time?
And you look at, like, the Holy Family, right? They're a pretty good
Yeah.
example.
Or just, like, what better way could a man bear the burden of his wife's illness than to bear that with her?
Mm-hmm.
Like, for guys, it's hard. I mean, oh my God, I get it. It's really hard. Like, but there's, like, what greater act of love to say, you know what, I'm going to suffer this disease with you, because that's one of the effects, that doing this is a bad idea, so I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it with you because we are one flesh. So, like, if I were talking to someone, I'd pull the guy aside and go, look, dude, you got to man up. Like, this is what you signed up for?
It's romantic.
Yeah, it is.
In every sense of the word.
Yeah, it truly is. But those cases, like, I mean, I spent a lot of time teaching bioethics, and I mean, those cases are not as prevalent as people make them out to be.
Yeah, if there's like 2 in your church, you hear about them. Or
Yeah,
something.
and even if it's that many, that it's like life-threatening, and you know, those they're not as. Some of it is. I would probably tell them to go to a better doctor. Find a Catholic doctor that understands that. You know what? Is this really true? Like, and if that's really the case, why are you trying to give me a birth control pill and not treating what's wrong with me?
Mm-hmm.
Like, why are you throwing a pill at my symptoms rather than at what's actually wrong with me? Because in a lot of ways, I mean, now sort of as you guys get out in the world, that is especially ladies, doctors' tendencies. If you have any sort of health issues in that area, they're like, hey, just take the pill. It'll take care of your symptoms and won't treat what's actually going wrong.
By the way, if you need a good OBGYN, I know one. They don't
There you go.
birth control at all.
There's a clinic in Cary that's
Yeah,
really
very
good at
Cary.
that.
It's called Reply. Highly recommend.
I mean, so that would be sort of, you know, again, you know, I wouldn't go out in the brickyard and preach that, like, hey, you know, but people you know, yeah. I mean, I would definitely like challenge the guy and say, you want to be a man or not? Like,
People don't like it when you say that to them. It's effective.
yeah, they don't like it in a good way.
Yeah.
So like either they'll punch you or they'll actually man up.
But even if they punch you, they'll think about it.
Yeah. So one last part to this is at the end of Humanae Vitae, Paul VI makes a bunch of predictions, which you guys may or may not have heard before, but he was like pretty much spot on.
Nailed it.
So his 4 predictions are: there's going to be an increase in marital infidelity, check. A general lowering of moral standards, check. A man grows accustomed to the use of contraceptive methods and may forget the reverence due to a woman. I don't know.
You should have said,
Me Too might have something to do with that.
you should have said should or will.
Governments will coerce people into using contraception and intervene in citizens' sexual relationships. And that doesn't, immediately you think, oh yeah, it's China. Like, it's here too.
We're taking it other places.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we should all be a little
This is
disturbed.
a public university, and they tell their RAs to hand condoms out.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
They do.
Yeah, it creates the sort of soft way in which it's done. And then the way in which we are making a ton of enemies in Africa right now. Because we try to tie aid to contraceptive use. Really disturbing. Really disturbing. And the women don't want it. Like, they're very clear about, I don't want this. I want children. Like, if you see all these polls of, like, in Africa, like, I think it's like the average number of children that an African woman wants is like 7. And that's what she wants, right? So I don't think she really, you can say that they want birth control, but that's not really what they want.
Well, Nigeria is like half, or the size of Texas, and half the population of the U.S.
Yeah, because they're like, okay, you know what, we understand what a person is, and yeah, we might be a little backward economically, but we know the more people you have, guess what people are? People are creative. They're not drains on society. They're creative. Well, when America has like no people and we have all the people, guess where we'll be. So they get it, right? These backward people in Africa, they get it. But the fact that, we're enforcing this on other people and telling them what they want rather than having them tell us what they want. And then obviously just you could just, the consequences don't always make something wrong, but it certainly shows, it's evidence that Paul VI was right. That when you begin to see this, that it just creates this culture of use. All right, questions, comments?
I just get really annoyed that it feels so obvious. And I mean, I converted 3 years ago, and it wasn't obvious to me before that, so I'm like mad at myself too. But it's like, it's hard to remember, I guess, if you didn't switch sides, so to speak, that it's actually very convincing on the other side. But it still really sucks that it's so convincing because it feels so obvious.
You have to. I mean, you have to understand, like, the gift of faith is a gift, right? And with it comes out the clarity that not everyone has it. It's not because they're stupid. It's just because they don't have the gift, right? Yet. So yeah, you can say these things, and it's. I think I probably shared this this comment before with you guys, but I can remember one of my coworkers coming to me, and we were talking about something, and he said, "Oh, you're Catholic. You don't believe in birth control." And I said to him, "Well," I was like, "You believe in birth control? Like, it exists. It's a real thing. It's like, that's something just we don't just like shield our eyes and say it doesn't exist." I said, "But we just happen to think it's a really bad idea." And he was very intrigued. He's like, "What do you mean a bad idea?" And we went through all the reason why it's a bad idea, right? And I didn't condemn him. I didn't. In the end, he asked me to stop because he said, "If you keep going, I'm going to have to change how I do things," which is a little sad. And I don't know what he ended up doing. But there's a sort of this, you got to understand, it is truly in this culture a hard saying. And there has to be a certain amount of readiness to hear it. And for all of you to just imbibe this now is really important because you guys are sort of the prophets of the next generation, right? Like where you really understand this, and then which is a lot of what John Paul II says, is not just you understand it intellectually, but you live it. And you live it in a way that ultimately is convincing, right? And beautiful. And you're like, oh, like, I'm miserable, and this dude is like free. He's happy. And the world says that this guy should be repressed, but he's happy and free. Why is that? And it begins to sort of resonate with people. So that part is really important, right? Is to imbibe it and then live it. And it's not like I walk around going, with a T-shirt on that says "I'm pro NFP," but it's just the idea of it, right? It's just saying, like, huh? I could. I don't know if I would do that, but that's my thing.
Very bad.
Yeah.
Maybe a bumper sticker or something.
Yeah. My wife would have to get rid of that. Rid of the "I'm a stupid" T-shirt that she would wear at the same time. Yes, Steve.
So I don't really have a direct question, but all that we talked about came from the perspective of a married couple, whether it was good or bad. How does it essentially work the other way? Like, is it still unitive outside of marriage if it's fully like free and not?
Yeah. So would and again, take it from like the perspective of someone of goodwill. So there's not just a hookup. Is that what you mean? Yeah. So no, it wouldn't be unitive only because they're lacking something. They're lacking the commitment, the full commitment to each other, right? And so it becomes that's the thing is to make sure that we understand. Like it's not that it's like unitivity. Is that a word? It's something you turn on and turn off in a sense, but it's an act. Like all acts say something. Right? Like if I shake your hand, it's we have a deal on it. We shake hands. That means okay, we've agreed to this deal, right? And that handshake is a physical act that means something else, right? And when two people get together and have sex, that act means something, It means that I am totally yours, that I am faithfully, fruitfully, forever yours. But I'm really lying to you. I'm not, because I haven't made that commitment to you yet.
There's a verse in one of Paul's letters that essentially says, "Woe to you who joins with a prostitute, because the two of you will become one flesh, like they'll join in their sin." Essentially, how does that apply?
Yeah. So what he means by that is really just in the sense of what he's saying is you're doing something that is ultimately uniting you to this person, but it's a union in sin. Yes.
Well, I think that kind of points to the communal nature of our faith. You can't get to heaven alone. We're all responsible for each other in some way, and by you becoming so closely tied with that person, it's you become so closely responsible for them. You cause them to sin by you joining with them in that way.
And also, in that case, they would cause you to sin.
It's just all that.
That was the best segue ever. You need to do it on purpose, I don't think. So next week we're talking about love and responsibility. And that's really what John Paul II's point is if you love someone, you become responsible for them. You want to be responsible for them. And that includes not just responsibility here and now, making sure they have clothes, but for their eternal destiny. Yes?
So, kind of bouncing off Keegan's original question again, you're saying sex outside of marriage can never be fully committed or unitive.
Yeah, because it's predicated on a lie, right? It's saying one thing when you're really doing another.
Because your argument would be that if they were fully committed, they would have been married.
Yes.
Essentially.
Well, yeah, it's not even if they were fully committed. Marriage is a reality that changes you. It actually makes you that thing, right? It makes you fully bound to that. But that's what St. Paul is saying. He's okay, it's not just the fact that we have this contract where she does the dishes, I'll put the kids to bed on Tuesdays and Thursdays. It's this total, a man leaves his wife, leaves everything, leaves his mother, father, leaves everything behind, and becomes a new reality with this person. And that new reality, so it's not just because they haven't made the ultimate commitment. It's that they're living in a way that isn't based on the truth. So sex is something that only married people do, because only married people do it, right? It's because it's part of marriage, and it's just because you really like someone or you're really committed to them, you can't then it's going back to handshake example. Maybe this will help. So we make a deal on something, we shake hands. And in my mind, I'm saying, I am 97% committed to this agreement when I shake his hand. Is that okay? No, right? It would still be, and that's really what that is, right? It's this idea of, I'm really committed to this person, but not that much.
Let your yes be yes.
Yeah.
And I like the point that the sacrament actually does something, because it's not your own power that brings you together in marriage. It's not you get to say yes hard enough. It's actually a sacrament. It does something. It changes.
Yeah, and that's sacramental nature. Within marriage, the marital embrace, every time a couple comes together, what that person is saying is, if my wedding was today, I would take you again. It renews it every single time. And this is why, this is the Catholic vision of married life is so beautiful, because it's not, something that you just do in marriage because God just sort of covers his eyes and goes, well, okay, I'll just let him have this, or this little bit. But it's him really saying it's actually in marriage. It's a meritorious act. It's a good act, right? Because of what it actually says. It says, you know what? It was 20-something years ago. To this day, I didn't make a mistake. I'm so glad I did it. I would do it again. All right, other questions? So your question is really good and really a long, drawn-out answer, because I know I didn't give it a good answer. But I bet if we come back to it in 6 weeks, there'll be a really good answer to it.